Welcome to the Kennedy Report. I'm Kennedy Hall. I'm back with my friend Joe Polka. He's here to help. Let's make this look different here. I think we've got this one's okay, but we'll do this. There you go. See your beautiful face a little clearer.
Ooh, up close and personal here.
Yeah, we were just talking
report.
about. That's right. We were just talking about haircuts. Joe got his haircut. I got my haircut. The dad joke is, I got them all cut. So you can make jokes like that when you have got kids. And I've got 5 kids now. So the more kids I have, the worse my jokes get. But the more they have to laugh. Otherwise, I don't feed them. I'm kidding. I just don't give them dessert. Okay. So yesterday, what happened, Joe?
What happened yesterday? What didn't happen yesterday? Geez. What did I message you while it was going on? I said, I called it something like a demolition derby. It was we're referring, of course, to Caspian versus brother Peter Diamond there on Matt Fradd's channel, Pints with Aquinas.
So what was the debate about?
Sedevacantism.
That's right. That's what we're here to discuss today. And now I'm going to, Caspian is a friend of mine, and the purpose of this episode, we're not necessarily going to be, it's not about who won. To be honest, I think I would never probably debate this Brother Diamond guy. He argues like Rain Man, you know. It's like he didn't even say hello. At one point, you know, Caspian's all cordial and has manners and is like, hey, thanks for having me. I'm just gonna start making my point here, and I appreciate this, and blah, blah, you know, all the opening niceties you're supposed to do as a grown man in a conversation with another grown man. And when it was Diamond's turn, he just starts talking without saying without saying hello or anything. It was faster than they could unmute him to get him on. And he's just like, Pope so-and-so is a heretic because he's a heretic because I found he's a heretic and he's a heretic, you know. And it was like, boom, 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 without anything. So Diamond was very bullish. He had really good points. Like, we'll talk about some of those more difficult to answer Sedevacantist points, but he was very bullish in his approach. And I think that anyone debating someone like that would be a little bit caught off guard because there really was no decorum, if that makes sense. He almost seemed like you ever watched the biography of the fight between Marvin Hagler and was it Tommy Hearn? Was it Hagler and Hearn, right? And Hagler it was the one that was like 3 rounds, but it's one of the greatest boxing matches in history. And Hagler would like go to train for war, he said, and he'd go to like these resort hotels in New England during the winter where no one was there and just train like a madman and go swimming in the ice cold water and stuff. And when he got in the ring, it just was and he exploded. To be honest, that was the kind of feeling I had. I was like, okay, this guy is ready for war in this debate, and it's going to be that sort of thing. So all that being said, there were a lot of interesting points. We're going to be very fair to Sedevacantism here. I'm not anti-Sedevacantist, to be honest, as we'll talk about. I think it's a very confusing topic, and I understand why people in this day and age believe it. I get it for sure. It's not like you're some sort of heretic because you have a different opinion on something that is sort of confusing, right? But I do think that there were holes in Brother Diamond's arguments, and I think in a different format, it would have been easier to sort of refute him in that. What are your impressions, and what say you about the whole debate thing?
Now, I don't have anything against Jeff Caspian personally. I don't have anything against Brother Diamond personally either. So I could kind of watch it somewhat fairly.
Right.
I mean, there was a clear winner. I don't even need to say, but
Matt Fradd.
That's for sure. Unless, and I will say, unless people continue in the YouTube comments and on Twitter with their calls to take the debate down, which I find to just be preposterous and cowardly. So there's people that want to go around, and this was one of the main themes after the debate happened. A couple of notable accounts were saying, this debate has to come down or it'll cause scandal. And one of my very close Twitter friends, Twitter mutuals, is Trevor from Tridentine Brewing, who made a really good observation about that. He said, he quote tweeted one of the posts about that and said, well, Matt Fradd has all kinds of debates on his show all the time. I mean, he has debates he aired the famous debate between James White and Pat Madrid about Calvinism and sola scriptura, all kinds of debates concerning Protestantism. So the absurdity of these people yelling and screaming to take it down it is telling, I think. I don't know why exactly they find Sedevacantism to be more scandalous than Protestantism. It's a bit of because these are, as far as I'm concerned, now to use the term Sedevacantist is to paint with a bit of a broad brush. So
let's define that first here. So let's just go over some of the different ideas about Sedevacantism. So not all Sedevacantists, meaning seat is vacant, believing there is no pope. Not all of them are unified. In fact, there's a lot of division. Brother Diamond does not actually speak for the Sedevacantist world as a whole, although many of his talking points, no one speaks for the Sedevacantist world as a whole, but he especially doesn't. He's also, if I'm not mistaken, I believe he's a Feeneyite, which is a condemned heresy. Now, I want to give my caveat there. Father Leonard Feeney did die in the church. And there are many people who are disciples of Father Leonard Feeney in a general spiritual sense, but they don't necessarily go as far as he did for a time about his understanding of baptism. So even the Feeneyites don't necessarily represent all of the Leonard Feeney legacy. There are good people. I think Charles Coulomb is very close with the Feeney thing. I was just on a show recording with him this morning with Tim Flanders. He's clearly not a heretic, you know. There's just different emphasis some people put on the importance of how baptism should be understood, and that's fine. We can have that debate. But from what I've heard, Father Feeney was actually an incredible theologian and poet even. So I'm sure there was a lot to love about Father Feeney, and I have no ill will or anything. So, but there is this condemned Feeneyism per se that was condemned by the church. And Brother Diamond adheres to that as far as I can tell. And many Sedevacantists do not at all. So he can't even speak for all of them. So essentially though, Sedevacantism is sede vacante, seat vacant, is there is no pope. And here are the reasons why. And many of them, the mainstream version is there hasn't been a pope since Pius XII, which I find weak because I don't think John the 23rd was actually all that bad. And then it is a growing movement now with sort of a pseudo Sedevacantist with Benedict being pope, but then I guess they would say if he dies and Francis dies, there's enough cardinal electors that it'd be a valid election. I think that's the way out of that. Even it wouldn't end up in Sedevacante in perpetuity the same way that not having a pope since the 60s would, or the 50s. But then there is a growing movement of people who believe that Pope Francis, for example, has lost his office and is not the pope just because of his, external actions and sayings. So some of the more serious Sedevacantists would be like Bishop Sanborn, those who were ordained in the SSPX and then left for largely liturgical reasons in the 80s. And even amongst them, they have different disputes about different lines of valid bishops and so forth. It's too much of a web to go into here, but that's kind of a general overview. Is there anything we should add to make the conversation more fluid?
Yeah, no, I think that's fine. I think I would, I kind of put something out that it's kind of tripartite. So you have the SSPV, which were the original, which constituted the 9 in the original 9, which actually happened a couple miles where I was, the division there. The old SSPX chapel and the current SSPV chapel is where it all happened, right here on Long Island. I think a lot of just so we have our definitions completely straight, because I think a lot of people make this mistake. They'll say the SSPX, and then people will shorthand use SSPV to refer to Sedevacantist when it actually is completely false.
That's not true.
Yeah, it's not. So that the SSPV, for instance, on the books is not Sedevacantist. No. So they posit basically reasonable doubt, from what I understand, concerning the question of the Pope. I get it for sure. I actually think that's one of the more reasonable positions out there. Then you have the who you mentioned, Sanborn, Bishop Sanborn, who was affiliated with the late Father Cicada, who are Sedevacantists. I don't
Mhm.
think they're dogmatic Sedevacantists. Someone would probably correct me on that, but
I think you're right. I think you're right.
yeah, they would hold the I'm going to botch the word, the Casim thesis, which is
Yes, Caspian.
yeah. I'm sorry. There you go.
Casaccio, I think. Anyway, go on.
Yeah. People know what I'm talking about. Which would allege that could do a whole show on that. But that the current people have if they were to cease being what they would say heretics, they would then fulfill the office.
Yes, that is actually that's a dispute right now within Sedevacantism because Sanborn heads up the Sedevacantist seminary, and a lot of Sedevacantists don't buy that theory. They're kind of hierarchy ended in 58, but they call it the thesis theory. I've heard them call it the thesis Sedevacantist. So basically, there's a loss of office because of heresy, but in principle, the office is still filled by a man, so the office is still there, which can validly elect. Basically, it's like the Pope exists as almost an administrator or something without any faith and morals because he doesn't have the faith, according to the Sedevacantist theory. Which there is justification. We'll go through some of the arguments. Yeah. There is justification found for that in the literature. I am not just so people know if they're just joining us now. I'm not a Sedevacantist. I think there are some fatal flaws, although I do find it worthy of discussion amongst people of goodwill. Let's put it that way.
Yep.
Also, like this video, subscribe to this channel, and click the link in the description to see how you can help us continue to grow. So thank you for doing that. That's right. Smash the like button, whatever the YouTube people say. Okay. All right. So let's get to the meat and potatoes of the debate. So the debate started off with Caspian making a very good beginning of here's sort of the continuity of the church, the foundation. Christ has a visible church and so on and so forth. Not having a pope would be an absurdity, which is one of the strong arguments, I think, overall. And his was more of a rhetorical argument with some scripture and things like that, of course, and some allusion to various councils and things. And that was important. But this was more of a constructing a sort of story of why the papacy is important and why the church could not have the papacy, if that makes sense. And then, or so why the church could not exist without it. And then Brother Diamond went into, these are the 75,000 reasons why the Pope since 1958 are all heretics. And here's the 75,000 reasons why. There are 75,000 reasons why. I don't even know if he stopped to breathe. And that's kind of his trajectory. And he obviously cited a lot of things. And in fairness, there are a lot of citations that would suggest that there could be something like Sedevacante. And my argument to that will be, it is a debatable question because it hasn't necessarily been de fide settled, like a lot of disputes in the church. So you can find quotes. We'll go over some. I have some stuff that we'll bring up from Bellarmine and from Suarez and various popes of various people who have discussed this, various theologians who have discussed this issue of the Pope. And there is room for debate. They debate each other on it. So yes, people can be like, well, I'm not really sure if I agree with you on that. So I don't fault Diamond for believing that he could believe some statements that he's found that support his position, because they exist, is what I'm saying. My argument essentially is that it's not settled, and therefore I believe it's probably wrong to definitively say that it is the position, because no competent church authority has even defined what that would look like. And I think in that case, we have to follow Aquinas, where he basically would, he would basically say we have to give the benefit of the doubt to all Christians. So especially the Pope would probably be important for that. Real quick, before I let you jump in here, I want to actually just bring up, because one of the biggest, what's the word I'm looking for? Justifications is this idea that the popes are heretics, right? Which you could make the argument that that there definitely have been some heretical things said by popes. But there's actually, I want to bring up Thomas Aquinas's definition of heresy, because it's kind of telling. Okay. So everyone can see, can you see that fine on the screen there? I should probably make it bigger. I think it's pretty small. There we go. That's better. Okay. So this is from the Catholic Encyclopedia, pretty neutral source. And Thomas defines heresy as a species of infidelity in men who, having professed the faith of Christ, corrupt its dogma. So that's a very generic form of heresy. So of course I could say Father Martin's a heretic, right? Because he has obviously been ordained a Catholic priest and then corrupts the dogma. That's pretty basic. But at the same time, there are different levels of heresy, and then there is also the reality that we have to distinguish between someone being a heretic in the objective sense. So down here, he talks about such heresy is merely objective or material. So, for example, if someone has not been declared a heretic by the competent authority, like a Father James Martin, but says heretical things, I would argue that materially Father Martin is a material heretic. But Aquinas goes on to say, in order for someone to be seen as sort of a manifest, that's a word that Diamond kept using, is they're all manifest heretics. And I believe he used that word wrong. He also used the word occult wrong, which I'll talk about. Aquinas says pertinacity, that is obstinate adhesion to a particular tenet, is required to make heresy formal. So you basically have to be confronted by a competent authority, and then you have to persist in that. That's pertinacity. So you continually, and this is exactly, for example, what we find if we look over, and this is a selection from some works from a website about it. I think those are selections from a book, but anyway, St. Paul talks about the argument from authority is based on St. Paul, who orders that a heretic is avoided after 2 warnings. That is, after showing himself to be manifestly obstinate. So this idea that there has to be some sort of, you have to prove the person's a heretic by showing that they've been warned about it and have manifestly continued in it. That's kind of, I think, a good primer for what a heretic would even be. What do you say?
Yeah. So I don't recall if Peter Diamond made the distinction. I think he did. I've recently gone, I don't want to say gone down the rabbit hole, but have done a bit of research because I might be reviewing Father Cicada's book on the liturgy for 1 Peter 5. So I've been reading his work and looking at his videos, and similar arguments were made by Diamond that you might hear Cicada make or have made. So now what they posit is the distinction between the delict of heresy, so and the legal ramifications, like juridical heresy, basically, versus the sin of heresy. So my understanding of their argument there is that, so because one of the common objections that non-Sedevacantists make contra Sedevacantism is that, you can't judge the Pope and you can't judge the magisterium, so on and so forth. And there's truth to that. But what they're saying is, and they're echoing Bellarmine, that it's the ipso facto loss of office because of the sin of heresy. So you commit the sin of heresy, which heresy is obviously a sin.
Yep.
You just like that lose the office. Not bell book and candle, slamming the gavel, you're out of the church. Just it's an acknowledgement of an external reality, basically. So I thought, and in my head, the comparison for that would be, so public sin, which heresy would be a public sin, can necessarily have a public consequence. So it so this can extend into one of the debates that were not debates, but one of the problems that we're seeing now with the Francis pontificate and the Amoris Laetitia. Francis attached the Argentinian interpretation of Amoris Laetitia as the acta to Amoris. This is the interpretation of it. It is at this point, the Argentinian interpretation of it is magisterial. So what do we see? The divorced and remarried, as such, they commit a public sin. And what happens when you commit that public sin of adultery?
If you die that way.
Well, there's that, and then there's the public consequence of that sin, which is being denied Holy Communion, which is public. It's an outward public symbol of being cut off from the church and cut off from communion in a very official way. This creates, and you were talking about the distinction between the Sedevacantists who hold John the 23rd onward. I also see a problem with saying John the 23rd is not Pope. And those who are, I don't want to say Benny-Plenis because I actually think that's a ludicrous position. But
it's Gnostic.
It's probably, I have to say, and I respect like Dr. Mazza a whole lot, for instance. I find him to be kind. I was on a panel with him. But I just I do think it's an intellectual dead end. But the better argument would be, if you don't want to say Francis is not Pope, the better argument would be to say that there is a sense in which the acta is manifest heresy.
I agree with that. A caveat we should add to that too, though, is, and this is something I didn't see either of them talk about in the debate. Personally, I think one of the biggest antidotes to everything we're going through in the church is understanding the theological notes. So I would look at Pope Francis's acta given to a regional bishops' conference about how to interpret a document as being a very low level of doctrinal authority. That's what I would say. I can't articulate exactly why given chapter and verse, but it just strikes me as, considering precedent, considering previous encyclicals, considering anathemas and councils, considering all these things, that's a very low level and could be just rejected or ignored. And I think that's an area where there's not a lot of nuance in the conversation about from the Sedevacantist position, because if something is not actually binding on the faithful, then it's very difficult, for example, to say that the Pope has put out heresy in a public way, in the sense of the people must adhere to it. That's a little bit into the weeds, but that's kind of, I think, one of the counter arguments. And I will say too, though, there is a process, according to some, for deposing a pope for heresy. So we look at Father Bellarmine. I'll share this here. He was a pretty good theologian, widely read in the 1800s, if I'm not mistaken. And so he talks about how this could happen. And I actually should say as well, Suarez, who's a big deal. I love Suarez because I love the late scholastics. He talks about this idea that the Pope, he calls it a common opinion. Where is it? I'm missing it. Oh, yeah. In no case, even that of heresy, is the pontiff deprived of his dignity and of his power immediately by God himself before the judgment and sentence of men. This is the common opinion today. So the late scholastics, according to Suarez, who's seen as an official theologian of the church, is that the common opinion is that there would be no deposing of the Pope automatically. But there is a process, according to some, how this could happen. And this would be found in Bellarmine, where he says, the cardinals who are his counselors can do this, that is, depose him, or the Roman clergy or the Roman synod, if being met they judge this opportune. For any person, even a private person, the words of St. Paul to Titus hold, avoid the heretic after a first and second correction, knowing that such a man is perverted and sins, since he is condemned by his own judgment. For the person who admonished once or twice does not repent, but continues pertinacious in an opinion contrary to a manifest or public dogma, not being able on account of this public pertinacity to be excused by any means of heresy properly so called, which requires pertinacity, this person declares himself openly a heretic. Okay. And he says he reveals that by his own will he has turned away from the Catholic faith and the church in such form that now no declaration or sentence of anyone whatsoever is necessary to cut him from the body of the church. This is a money part. Therefore, the pontiff, who after such a solemn and public warning by the cardinals, by the Roman clergy, or even by the synod, maintained himself hardened in heresy and openly turned himself away from the church, would have to be avoided according to the precept of St. Paul. Okay, that's actually, I think, probably, that's one of the most complete and strongest cases I've seen about what to do in a situation like this. It's scriptural. It's clear that there's a way to do it. Going back to scripture and finding an actual, if a public heretic is to be avoided, then you would have to avoid the Pope, if he's a public heretic. It's pretty logical in that sense. It does seem that in Bellarmine's position and opinion that you could have some sort of synod to do it. Again, there are arguments that could be made that you lose your office if you are a manifest heretic. But my point with this is, if I would say this to Brother Diamond, if I was ever to speak to him, I doubt I would, is that this is a debated question by doctors, scholastics, and great theologians of the church. So although it is okay to disagree on how we ought to go about this, prudentially, we cannot come out and say, this is the position that is now dogmatically so, because it just has never happened. There was something else I wanted to add as well. Oh, yeah. Brother Diamond kept coming out with this idea of being a manifest heretic. I believe he used that term wrongly and the term occult heretic wrongly, because occult, it means secret. So you find in the writings of Bellarmine and Suarez and things like that, if someone could be an occult heretic, meaning they're just a heretic personally and no one really knows, or maybe they know, but it's not really like some official thing. It's like so-and-so doesn't really believe in like baptismal regeneration. That's kind of weird, you know? So Caspian kept saying that to him, and he had good points as to why, what occult heresy would have to do with the papacy and all these sorts of things. And Brother Diamond replied completely fallaciously, excuse me, and said when these theologians were talking about occult heresy, they meant actually being part of the occult. So like witchcraft and things, which is not the case whatsoever. When I saw him make that argument, I realized he has an agenda. Personally, this is what I believe. And that's just not true. Secondly, I mean, you read Bellarmine is not talking about witchcraft. Occult means secretive. You are in the occult. We use that term because it's a secret society type thing, but occult just means secret. And then also, he kept using the term manifest heretic. Here's the problem with our age, and this is why we're going to do some shows on modernism. A heresy is a very particular thing. So Lutheranism is a heresy. So if somebody who is a Catholic joins the Lutheran Church, he is a manifest heretic. It is now manifest that he is a heretic because he's left the church and is making that it's clear that he's aligning himself with the defined heresy of the church. A Donatist is a heretic. I think Brother Diamond's arguments were basically Donatist as well. A Jansenist. I mean, go on and so on and so forth. You find all these. In our age, the heresy is modernism, but there's no way to declare that you're a modernist. You can't join the modernist sect. You can't join the modernist movement or something like that. You get close. You can join the modern Jesuits, but that's not the point. But you know, it would. I think when I'm reading these writers from 300, 400, 500 years ago, when they're writing about a manifest heretic, that means a very particular thing. If the Pope were to come out and say, "I'm a Lutheran now," he's a manifest heretic, or you know, I solemnly reject the Tridentine formula of X, Y, and Z and accept that of Martin Luther. That'd be a manifest heresy. Do you think that that's worth making that distinction? Because I think I think the way he used manifest was weak, if that makes sense.
Yeah, a couple things. So what you have in what if I was to play devil's advocate, they for the case of Suarez, the Sedevacantists would. I was actually just brushing up on it this morning because I knew we were going to talk about this. They would allege that basically, so what you had was Suarez and John of St. Thomas holding that view, the one of basically a judgment, a council of cardinals or something like that, being the ones to who would be the ones to render a judgment like that, versus Bellarmine, and who alleges ipso facto, right? So what they use magisterially to try to settle that argument, and you could, I don't know the letter of it off the top of my head, but would be Paul IV, cum ex apostolatus officio. So, which would say that, which seems to side with Bellarmine. So they want to use modernism as a heresy in the same way as Arianism or well, you name it, right? It's hard to use modernism in that sense because of how, like Pius X said, it's the swamp of the heresies. It's a synthesis of all the heresies. It kind of denies without denying for the most part. What happens is that, and this is why it creates a twofold problem. It's why I think Sedevacantism is so hard to dismiss out of hand, which I think a lot of people try to do. I really do think a lot of people try to make it as though they don't submit to the Pope, therefore schismatic. And I think they are, what they say these days is coping. So but by trying to say that they're objectively schismatic in that way, I don't believe that. There may be some. I am uncomfortable with dogmatic Sedevacantism, which is where Peter Diamond would be squarely. which is to say that if you are not a Sedevacantist, you are thus outside the church. I don't believe that at all. Well, I'm not a Sedevacantist per se, but I think that position is pretty rough. I don't think that's correct in any sense. But there are those that say, well, I'm a Sedevacantist, but just because you're not one doesn't mean you are automatically outside the church. It's just a question of being correct or incorrect. What happens is, I think, so modernism being like the sort of hazy, hard to put your finger on heresy that suggests more than it says, could manifest in things like, well, is it okay to go to? There was a comment on YouTube that I was talking to somebody about. That was a guy that was in RCIA watched it, and he said, well, okay, if I'm converting to Catholicism right now, and if my girlfriend's a Lutheran, according to X, Y, and Z in Vatican II, I could go pray with her in her Lutheran church. When that's wrong.
Yep.
It's incorrect. And then I really think this Amoris Laetitia thing is a problem. That's my opinion. Because that is a very tangible result of modernism. So,
yep.
And you do ask yourself, and I think it's a serious question. If I follow the magisterium of the church, if I follow Vatican II, if I follow the actions of Francis and John Paul II, if I follow Francis's teaching on divorce and remarriage, will I end up in hell?
It's a very good possibility.
And when the Sedevacantist says, well, the church magisterium can't lead you to hell, therefore they're not the church magisterium, that's not a crazy thing to say.
No, it's not. It's not a crazy thing. And this is why I believe that we'll get into our Marcel Lefebvre love fest here, because obviously we're both, say hello. There you go. He's behind you. This is why I think the Society of St. Pius X position is the most reasonable. And here's why. When you ask the SSPX about, first of all, the SSPX are not Sedevacantists, as they're not. And in fact, they have to take an oath against it or promise against it when they're in seminary and ordained. And that's not because Marcel Lefebvre never looked at the question of it. When John Paul II was out there with Assisi, which was, again, something like that happens in the Old Testament, and it's like you get swallowed up by the earth, or like a plague comes the next day. Like it's people. We are so imbibed with religious indifferentism as a culture because we live in a liberalist sort of liberalism infected culture that we just don't. It doesn't hit us in the gut. But to someone like Lefebvre, who grew up in sort of the older ways, obviously, and then also was a missionary in a pagan land, this idea you would have animists. I'm writing my book on Lefebvre right now, and I'm at the point, I'm about 40 pages in, and I'm writing at the point where sort of closing the chapter on his life in Africa. And I'm putting a citation from Cardinal Sarah in the book, where he talks about how the Holy Ghost Fathers, they're called the Spiritans today, but that was Lefebvre's order that he was superior of before he retired. In 1912, Cardinal Sarah's literal parents were taken out of animism, so worshiping like demons and nature. That was Cardinal Sarah's parents were devil worshippers by birth. I mean, whether they actually ever did, I hope they didn't, but you know what I'm saying? That's what they were born into. And then they became faithful Catholics because of the Holy Ghost Fathers, and their son is a cardinal of the church. And he's one of the better ones. I mean, he's conservative Orthodox. We wish he'd do a little more here and there, but in this day and age, I mean, goodness gracious, it's hard to find a better guy, that as far as doctrine is concerned, the Cardinal Sarah. So a man like Lefebvre looking at Assisi, he scratched his head and he went, what's the quote? You can't say that there's no Pope. I can't say that there's no Pope, but I can't say that you can't say there's no Pope. It's kind of like, because again, it is a disputed question, but prudentially, the SSPX, no one in the society is a Sedevacantist unless it's secret. They're very clear on this. And, even in the Angelus Press hymnal, if you've got like the updated version from 2015 or whatever, it says Franciscus when you're doing benediction, right? It's not just the Pope and like N for insert name. It's printed Franciscus, okay? They are not sedes. But with all things in the society, it's a prudential decision. And this is what I believe is missing in the dogmatic Sedevacantist position. Yes, Bellarmine, the Pope you mentioned, Paul IV, would give you the where you could say you could be lose your office as a pope. However, there is dispute on what would constitute a manifest heretic, given the definitions of what it means to actually be publicly a heretic. On top of that, there are theologians who are big deals who would disagree and offer counter arguments, Cajetan, Suarez, and so forth. These are not little names. This is not like, so-and-so who's in the theology department at Fordham University. These are like big name theologians in the church. In our day, they'd all be saints because everyone's canonized today, but they're very saintly. And so prudentially, you look at it and you go, taking a dogmatic view on there being no pope is, I think, a big mistake. And the Society of St. Pius X also takes a similar position. We talked about Vatican II briefly here. They have a prudential decision to Vatican II. This is why they say, listen, this thing has some nuclear elements, and we're going to talk about that, but we're not going to say that it's not a real council or something like that, right? This is something that happened in the history of the church. We will continue to negotiate with Rome and say, can you please clarify this? Because all of the history of the church says that you're wrong on this. Tell us how you're not. Okay. There's actually been some clarifications because of those negotiations, which has been helpful. So prudentially, we stay away from the novelty of the council. We stay away from the new mass, and we stay away from the Sedevacantist position because we cannot dogmatically say that it is. Personally, I think that I think the Society's position is the solution to these sorts of questions in general, because I will say the following as well. I'm watching this fellow, Peter Diamond, and I'm not going to judge the man's character or heart, but if this guy's a brother of the church, you're supposed to be a consecrated religious, didn't come off to me like he presented himself as someone who's seeking holiness. It was very bullish. It was very, again, there weren't even any niceties. There was no charity. And I don't sound like a liberal, there was charity, but you know what I'm saying? There was no like I imagine I could sit down with a guy like Trent Horn, who I probably disagree with on certain things, probably pretty strongly, but he seems like an actual Catholic of goodwill who wants to go to heaven and be saintly in his virtue. And we probably would be able to disagree firmly without ever having the lack of niceties or this almost gotcha mentality. That's not an argument against Sedevacantism per se, but I just think when I look into these debates, it's almost like people gravitate to the Sedevacantist position as a way of being like, I've won. I figured it out. Especially these guys on Twitter, I figured it out. You're an idiot if you don't agree with me. That's the impression that I get. And to me, that's kind of like the fruits of that are not so good. What do you think?
Yeah, I would say it depends on who. That's been my experience, and I hate to sound like I'm shilling for them too much, but
no, you're right though.
But they and look, it's a problem throughout Catholicism to paint with too broad of a brush, not just the Sedevacantist. Because think about when you say the word trad, right? What is that? And we had our previous show about the problems of the traditionalist movement. The dogmatism of, we got into young earth creationism, and then there was a whole discussion on that on Twitter. Whatever, we're not going to go into that. But I think it's part of a broader modern problem that we all fall into is precision. Trad. It's really nothing. Sedevacantist. It's they're almost meaningless terms that in their way. If you look at the CMRI, for instance, they have their own. If anybody knows anything of the history of the founding of the CMRI, I don't think it's meaningless that their founding is quite bizarre. If you know anything about Francis Schuckert, but in cases where, for instance, I know this is true where they were founded in Idaho in the United States, right? So the SSPX and the CMRI are geographically near each other. The CMRI.
So is the FSSP actually there?
Yeah. I know there's a lot of tension.
So-called.
Yeah, okay, it's a hotbed. But and I know this might be true in Kansas,
Mm-hmm.
that the CMRI, for instance, teaches that, well, okay, if you can't make it to one of our masses or a Sedevacantist mass, you can go to communion at an SSPX mass. I know people that do that.
Yeah, I know the same thing I've heard from people.
And so I think that spirit. So it's part of the broader unicum debate over whether in Sedevacantism whether or not you should attend a mass where Francis's name is said in the canon. There are about half say yes, about half say no. Sanborn and company say you should not. CMRI and their adjacent say knock yourself out because it's valid.
Yeah,
and licit because it's not the rite is virtually the same as the pre-55. So I think that spirit is Catholic. I
You're
think
right. That's not schismatic by what this term schismatic means. It's not. They're not seeking a separation from fellow Catholics.
Right, and I think the ones that want to say, well, you shouldn't be attending SSPX or anything like that, which they can't even dispute is valid. I do think that's a bit of a reach.
Yes,
for certain. And I keep saying this. I say this to people a lot regarding people who are uncharitable on Twitter or wherever else. The squeaky wheel always gets the oil. It's just it's a cliche, but it's as true as anything. So it's like, well, the loud people are going to be the ones who get attention. Now, yeah, Peter Diamond was bullish last night. I compared, for my UFC fans out there, I compared it to if anybody watched Brock Lesnar versus Frank Mir 2 from several years ago,
2012 or something.
Yeah, a long time ago. Yeah. It reminded me of that. It was very just kind of ground and pound, just absolutely relentless, not necessarily artistic or flowy or anything like that, but just bludgeoning. That's
I think it would have been different if they debated in person, because I think the energy would have. It is, but even there, it's like people would have gone. I think people would have been put off by it, if that makes sense, like and wouldn't have reacted well, because it would have been like, we're not here to watch a Calvinist versus low information Catholic and just beat him over the head with scripture. We're here to actually get to the bottom of a really complex theological issue, if that makes sense. But on the internet, that's a good format. This Matt Fradd does wonderful debate format, but there's limitations with not being in person.
Yeah, it adds it takes away a whole, like, you could DM with people all day long, but I think the element of breaking bread with somebody is really important, and being in person. So I do think that would have added a good
body
layer
language
to it.
It's big too.
Oh, it's huge. Yeah, if you know any, I was just having watched Peter Diamond on he's ended up on Lofton's like call-in show before, you know what I mean, and his I've not interacted with much of his material in general because I don't find it very tasteful. But for those of you who are tempted to Eastern Orthodoxy, for instance, which I would hope is nobody watching, but people are human. If anybody does a good job dismantling Jay Dyer, who happens to be a vocal proponent of Eastern Orthodoxy, Peter Diamond does a pretty good job. But their style is extremely. It's like what you saw on Pints with Aquinas, but it's usually worse, because he's one for being quite nasty and vocally nasty, not just bullish, but actually forwardly uncharitable. Many such cases with him.
Okay, two things we'll talk about before we got about 15 minutes here. Number one, I want to talk about some of the dangers I find in the Sedevacantist movement, which is, I'll bring up the term Donatist, okay? And then I want to talk about the Diamond kept making references to Lefebvre to try to prove that Caspian was kind of a hypocrite because Lefebvre said things that sounded Sedevacantist. But we'll talk about those things that Lefebvre said and defend those properly understood. And then we'll end. So what do I mean by Donatist? Okay. For people that don't know Donatist, so Donatism is kind of like the original Sedevacantism in a way. It's kind of the seeds of it. It's back in the time of St. Augustine, basically after these various apostasies, people apostate, basically if somebody acts in a way, they pinch incense to Caesar under the persecutions, that sort of thing, they clearly must not have been a real Catholic. And therefore they cannot be admitted back because they're not part of, basically it comes off as they're not part of the elect. It starts to sound like Calvinism. So can a true Christian ever lose their salvation? No, because a true Christian, if they're a true Christian, would never actually do anything to lose their salvation. That's kind of the circular reasoning of it. It's not unreasonable in a scriptural sense, taken certain parts of it, which is why Calvinism is so persuasive, because this idea of being the elect and actually being free from these things, if you are the elect, this is not, you don't take this with kid gloves. I understand why they get to these points. But Augustine, he won against Donatists using his rhetoric and holiness. And the way that he beat him, and actually the movie about Augustine that came out a few years ago is actually really good. And it shows it pretty well. Usually these movies are kind of corny, but this one's actually pretty good. And this is why Augustine is a doctor of grace. How could it be that you could be kicked out of how could it be that you're not a true Christian because you've sinned when the whole point is being saved from your sin? It's there's kind of a major issue there. And there's no teaching in the Bible or whatever that would say once you're ordained a priest, you are not, susceptible to original sin. So there are holes in this, this argument. And when I was listening to Peter Diamond talk, his argument about the popes obviously not being popes kind of hinged on, well, if they were, they wouldn't act this way. If they were, they would never talk like this. And it's like, that's actually not true. That is kind of a Donatism in this idea that, well, if he was a true priest, he would never apostatize. And it's like, no, he's just a man and he's a coward. And then he went to confession. And that's what people do when they sin, is they go to confession. Also, he brought up this idea of, Joe Biden. This is a way of him hammering on Jeff Caspian, right? Are you saying that basically he was trying to say heretics are people who do not profess the Catholic faith. Are you telling me that Pope Francis is a Catholic when he's giving communion to Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden? Does Joe Biden profess the Catholic faith? It was a very dishonest argumentation technique, because that wasn't actually at the heart of the matter. And it's also a nonsensical sort of argument, because actually Joe Biden, as detestable as he is, he does profess the Catholic faith when he says the creed. That's objectively what professing the faith is. He's a terrible Catholic and he's a bad man, and he's been obviously objectively publicly sinful and in a state of mortal sin, I would imagine. And Nancy Pelosi, same thing. She doesn't lose she's not outside the church because she's a publicly scandalous. If that were the case, if she couldn't go to confession. There was no nuance there. It's like, it's actually very difficult to not be in the church anymore. This is why I think manifest heresy has to be understood as joining a heresy officially, because that's a specific type of thing that if you come back from one of those, historically, you've had to have this sort of approved by bishops and the approvals to Rome and present it, because if you are a Catholic and you attend and you do something that is publicly heretical and you can go to confession, this is proof that you're still in the church. You see where I'm going with this? So even this idea that you would be out of the church because of heresy is a very high bar to prove, because in theory, someone could come into the church again or come back to the sacraments by confessing, which if you can confess and you're attending sacraments, you're communicating, which means you're a Catholic. Okay. So I think that was one of the holes in the argument. And I think that's one of the dangers that you fall into with Sedevacantism is I think a confused ecclesiology about who's in and who's not in the church. When you look at traditional catechisms, okay, there's always this distinction between the body of the church and the soul of the church. And you find this in the Christian Warfare Catechism, for example. The question basically is, are Protestants baptized into the Catholic Church as if they're baptized as infants? In a sense, they are. In a sense, they're not. Because they are part of the mystical body of Christ in a way, because they've been baptized in the Trinitarian formula. But then they don't grow up to profess the faith, so they're not part of the body of Christ in an external way. This is a very confusing thing, and this is made more confusing after Protestantism, of course. So this idea that heresy makes you a non-Catholic is very difficult to prove in an ontological sense, because you can't lose the character of baptism on your soul. It can make you an excommunicant. It can make you someone who joins something and is an apostate, But this idea that you ontologically stop being a Catholic I think is impossible to prove. So even this idea that even if we're understanding this idea that heresy puts you outside of the church, even there, it means in a juridical sense, but not in a sense that you're no longer Catholic and then cannot confess and then go back to your life as a Catholic. And this would have to apply to the Pope. So I think that's my final thing I'll say about the dangers before we get to Lefebvre is I think that there's a flawed ecclesiology at work in how these people argue whether or not you're in the church at all.
Yeah, my sympathy. I will be honest. My sympathies are with Peter Diamond there, and the reason being is that I'm just thinking on a personal level here. If somebody wanted me to choke out the phrase "Joe Biden is Catholic" or "Nancy Pelosi is Catholic" and mean it, I don't think I could do it. I don't know what the ramifications of this are. I tweeted something similar to this a couple months ago. I don't believe myself to be in communion with Nancy Pelosi. I don't believe I don't know what that means. But we're not kin, and that's like I'm not spiritually in communion. We're in different categories. I don't know what you are in a different category as her. And any of my well-meaning Archbishop Cordileone is in a different category than her. Yeah. Any of my well-meaning Christian and Catholic brothers and sisters are in a different category than her. So, and I do how would I logically parse that? Okay, Pelosi's able to come back to confession. Biden's able to come back to confession in theory, but would an excommunication have to be lifted in the objective realm? I'm not. I think. Let's put it this way: if it were 200 years ago, and this is the kind of nonsense that they were parading around, they'd be very different. They'd be so out.
Yeah. But an excommunicant is still a Catholic, is what I'm saying. That's why they can. They're not allowed to attend the sacraments, but they have not ontologically ceased being a baptized Catholic.
Is that right?
Well, yeah, because you can't be unbaptized. It's a mark forever.
Right. Yeah. So it's
think about Theodosius, right? So with Ambrose, he basically ordered the slaughtering of those who attended the gladiatorial circus games and things like that. Read the history of it; it's quite interesting. Theodosius was a Catholic emperor, was otherwise pretty good, fell into his old pagan military ways, which was pretty merciless, and Ambrose would not let him come in the church. He excommunicated him because the capital was in Milan at the time. But so he was out of communion with the church because of his public sin, but he was offered the chance at repentance, and then he had to put sackcloth and ashes and publicly whatever, and he could attend the sacraments again. So if he died in that state, he would have gone to hell because he would have died as an unrepentant public sinner. But the fact that he was able to publicly repent and then receive communion again, I'm on the thing here. We'll close the door, please. Now, close it, please. Okay. You couldn't say that now he's no longer ontologically a Catholic. If that's the case, then he can't go to confession and receive communion. So this is why I believe that they go a step too far. And I don't want to say Joe Biden's a good Catholic. Are you kidding me right now? I don't want to say that. But he is a Catholic by definition of being a baptized. Now, let's get to Lefebvre's statement here because we've got 5 minutes left. He brought up the statements of, Lefebvre said, they're not Catholic. They're not Catholic. They've left the church. Lefebvre said things like this all the time. There's a difference between speaking in hyperbole and speaking in a sense of speaking in hyperbole and a sense of speaking in I'm saying something as a juridical truth. So you find this all the time in saints. Look at some of Jerome's writings or some of St. Alphonsus Liguori. They'll use some really intense language to talk about like a sinner, like he's a swine or something like that. Does that mean that he believes that so-and-so becomes an actual hog when he commits a sin? Of course not. This is, and this is where there's no nuance in the Sedevacantist position from men like, it is a very literalist position, and this is a problem. So, for example, I was reading Catholic Culture. It's a good website, but man, they're hard on Lefebvre and the SSPX in a really almost obsessive way. It's very strange. But there's a beard hair on my microphone. But they too were making basically arguments Brother Diamond was. This is like the Novus Ordo and the anti-SSPX trads and the Sedevacantists shake hands, and But they were going through these quotes of Lefebvre where he would say, I am not part of the same church as them. I am not part of the conciliar church. And they say, look, Lefebvre was a schismatic. No, dinkus. Read who invented the term conciliar church. Do you know who it was?
No, who was that?
Okay, so Paul VI, at the closing of the council or somewhere around there, said the church of the council. That's dubious. There's no such thing as the church of... There is such thing as the church of the council in a metaphorical sense. Like the church of the Council of Trent has declared X, Y, and Z. You could use that, sure. But it doesn't exist as an actual ontological thing. There is no Church of Trent, unless there's a schismatic church that calls itself the Church of Trent. Okay? In the same way, Cardinal Benelli, who I voiced him in Father Murr's Murder in the 33rd Degree with an Italian accent, he wrote the letter in 1976 to the Society saying that the seminarians had to profess fidelity. You can find this in Michael Davies' work. Profess fidelity to the capital C conciliar capital C church. It was not Lefebvre who made up the term conciliar church. This is where Lefebvre rejected and said they cannot profess their fidelity to the conciliar church. That doesn't exist. The Catholic Church exists, and the Catholic Church had a council. You could say they have to profess their faith to the Catholic Church and all that has come from the Second Vatican Council. That would be fair as a statement. But he said they have to profess their allegiance to the conciliar church. The conciliar church does not exist. Again, if you're speaking, so when Lefebvre says they've left the church, they've joined, this is not the same church. What he's reacting to is they've told me that I have to be in fidelity to a conciliar church. I wasn't ordained into the conciliar church. So in a sense of being metaphorical, hammering home points, when he would say things like, they've left the church, this is the new church. What he's doing is reacting to the scandal that actually came out of Rome itself, which they had to correct. So when Peter Diamond used these examples of, well, Lefebvre said that they've left the church, they're not Catholic. Again, Joe Biden is not Catholic in the sense that he has no Catholicity to him. But in an ontological sense, yes, he's a baptized Catholic. I can say both things. The Catholic schools here in Ontario, they're not Catholic. They are Catholic they are Catholic in the sense that there are schools that are Roman Catholic, and the bishop, who is the valid bishop of the diocese, says these are under the care of blah, 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 blah. They actually on paper are Catholic schools under the norms of what the Catholic Church would say are schools. But as far as their, so in an external sense, they present themselves as Catholic. What goes on inside the walls is public school with a cross on the wall, and even worse at times. So there was no nuance in the way Brother Diamond presented Lefebvre's conversation there, and there was no background to why Lefebvre started saying those things. And when I saw that, I'm like, this is not honest the way that he's saying this, or he has greatly misunderstood Lefebvre, and he should probably understand him better. What say you?
I thought Caspian made a pretty big mistake vis-a-vis Lefebvre and his statements, because Caspian appeared to me to backpedal off of his favoring of the Archbishop, and off of his, he coming out with things like, I respect the fraternity and stuff like that. I mean, you can respect the fraternity on a human level. I mean, I'm sure they have some good priests and whatnot, but I'm not particularly impressed myself. And I think anytime you're Caspian's tactic in this debate was rhetorical. Yeah. And whenever you have Peter Diamond, a guy like Peter Diamond in his case, basically has Caspian up against the ropes with quotes from the Archbishop, and basically you have unfortunate attempts from Caspian to try to block and poorly explain away what amount to strong and meaningful quotes from the Archbishop.
Yeah, I mean that they're very important.
The idea of the conciliar church is, if you're going to put a capital C in front of it, it's capital C, conciliar church. That's schismatic on their part. On the part of the conciliar church, that is schismatic. And for the Archbishop to say that they need to convert to that these people need to convert to the Rome of all time, sure, but Archbishop Lefebvre's rhetoric was historically very, very strong. It's the kind of man he was, and
bishop in the old school.
And I think for it made Caspian, I believe, and again, this is with all due respect to him, it's not personal, but I do think it made him appear weak, and to say, oh well, everything's just fine, everything's prudence, everything's this, everything. So to me, he sounded like he was using rhetoric regarding Vatican II and rhetoric regarding, I guess, the Novus Ordo and the post-Vatican II magisterium that rang like Catholic answers to me. Everything is imprudent. Nothing's an actual problem. Yeah. And I was very unimpressed by that, and I found it unfortunate.
Yeah, you're right. Keep talking here for a sec while I find this, because I gotta find. No problem. I apologize here.
So, the tactic of Archbishop Lefebvre was, there was he was because of the circumstances, he was kind of caught in a whirlwind. There was a lot going on at once. So there was the Lefebvre, the Archbishop Lefebvre that wanted to be diplomatic, and that wanted to I don't want to use the word dialogue, but we're going to use it. That was willing to dialogue with Rome at the time. And then there was the Archbishop that said that Rome needs to convert, that there's a conciliar church. Fulton Sheen talks about the ape of the church, and I think in many ways that this conciliar thing is a manifestation of what Sheen was talking about. And there was the Archbishop that decried that completely. And the history of Lefebvre and Sedevacantism is more nuanced than people want you to believe it is. I think. While he never was one at all, but he was Cicada and Sanborn and the Nine. He was going to they were going to be suspended. Then he was going to walk back that suspension without them having to recant their Sedevacantist position. But as you explained, most of the issue with the Nine was liturgical. It wasn't necessarily the question of the Pope. It was a problem, but it wasn't the problem. It was the 1962 liturgical form, which I do, Saint Joseph's name being added to the canon. I don't really have an issue with something like that. Did you find it?
I did. I found a footnote. I don't know why this is probably the devil. I found this 1,000 times. Okay, so there's the footnote. I'll make it bigger here. So this phrase is conciliar church. It's in the documents. And then there's a footnote here from Davies. This phrase, it's right here. This phrase was used in a letter from Archbishop, now Cardinal Benelli, to Archbishop Lefebvre, dated June 25th, 1975. All right, 75, not 76. Archbishop Benelli demanded not true fidelity to the Catholic Church, but to the conciliar church. La fidélité véritable à l'Église conciliaire. Right there. Okay, so you see capital E, proper noun, church, Église. Okay. The full text of this appears in here. Actually, we should just say Cardinal Benelli 1975 conciliar, and we could probably actually find it. That's why I was putting in 76. That's why I couldn't find it.
The old keyword search.
Yeah. And anyway, you can look it up if you find it. Whether I'm going to find it here while we're recording this is debatable. But the point is, if you don't understand what Archbishop Lefebvre was talking about, then you're not going to talk about him properly. So when he says things like, this is not the Catholic Church, it's not, it's the conciliar church. And that's their term, not his. And you also find this in 1,000 other sort of Nouvelle Theologie types who would talk about this in a way. So, okay. There's so much more we could talk about. I think we've solved all the world's problems. It's a new springtime. We're good to go. This is the new evangelization is in full swing, and it's all good. The surprises of the Holy Spirit are everywhere. So
it's just wonderful, isn't it?
It's just wonderful. In closing, the debate was definitely a hard debate. I believe that there are lots of holes in Peter Diamond's arguments. Nonetheless, I believe that he presented them in a bullish fashion, which was difficult to respond to. And that's all I'll say about that. What say you?
Yeah, hey, it was quite a scene. We'll put it that way. It was definitely fun to watch. I hope Matt Fradd doesn't succumb to the pressure.
Cancel culture.
And and take cancel culture coming from alleged trads who can't. Absolutely incredible to me, because his argument was coherent, and if you can't stomach logic, then that sounds like your problem. But
just refute it. Make a video refute.
That's it. I mean, if I would be all for somebody, I would not do anything like that myself, but I would be all for somebody else going out there and debating him. So, but good heavens, if you're going to conflate that with scandal and say it's worse than Protestantism, why don't you tell me how you really feel and what you're actually afraid of? But the thing is, and I had this conversation with a relative who's a traditional Catholic. And I'm not married. I don't have any kids, but ultimately, we all know this conciliar church thing. Who cares? There's questions about its legal standing and its juridical standing and how Catholic it is and whether so on and so forth. And what really matters is that if you're a traditional Catholic and you're a family man, you wouldn't let your kids anywhere near these people. Anywhere near their schools, for the most part, anywhere near their churches, anywhere near their priests. And there's a good reason for that, because it's not we know what they're guilty of on that level, relating to children. But besides that, if you can't guarantee their faith with these people, that they'll grow up Catholic, what does that then in some sense they're not Catholic. I don't know what that means, but I know that to be the case, and I would just say keep yourself and keep your kids away from them, and and that's debates and legalities aside, I think that's what's most important.
Yeah, you're right, and this is this is the most important thing. Is I was just reading some things you were saying that Lefebvre would say about the conciliar church, and this debate has to be had. I think a strong SSPX apologist who understands Lefebvre and why his is the not to make it sound like an Anglican, but the via media, the golden mean between the two possible extremes. Not extreme in the sense of everything in moderation, but the sense of they are two possible true positions, so two possible goods, but isolated in and of themselves. You get this sort of everything's totally fine and there's no possible way that any pope could ever be bad, in the sort of papal maximalist Novus Ordo sense. And you have the papal maximalist Sedevacantist sense, which takes that but then kind of stratifies it and then flips it on its head. There's the very prudential, wise position, I think, that falls square in the middle, which is the Society of St. Pius X position, Marcel Lefebvre's understanding of staying away from the dangers of the conciliar revolution, not adhering to the fictitious conciliar church, but at the same time understanding that the Catholic Church exists and so does its hierarchy, and it's kind of a mystery how God will sort that out. So that's what I think. All right, ladies and gentlemen, like this video, subscribe to this channel, and let us know what you think in the comments. And I think that's all. This has been the Kennedy Report. Joe Boca is here to help. And until next time, God bless.